fast and call it Halloween, but that it's actually All Hallows Eve. It was the Eve of All Saints, which we will celebrate next week. It was the eve of the day by which the church was feast day of all the saints that were named. And saints are about giving us examples of who we should be and how we should be in the world as disciples of Christ. And so, it just so happens that in our scriptures today, we have two such characters. And sometimes saints were real people, and these were real, actual types of people in early Christianity when Christ walked the earth. And these are people and classes of people. And so we have a Pharisee, and we have a tax collector. And what you need to know as a sidebar for Pharisees is that in our Gospels, Pharisees are typically shown as arrogant, as hypocrites, as people not necessarily to be. But the reason they show up sometimes in this kind of critique of them is that it's kind of like getting information written by Democrats about Republicans or Republicans about Democrats. The Pharisees were part of Judaism, and they were part of a movement that sought to elevate and emphasize the laws of Moses and the Torah. But their goal was to reach out and have Judaism be accessible to all of the people. And because of that, they were in competition with the Jesus Reform movement that also sought to reform Judaism, remembering that all of them were Jews at this time. And so that's part of how we need to remember that when we see that in our scriptures in different forms. So that what we have are two stereotypical characters. You might even say they might have worn masks. And so we have someone dressed up as the tax collector in our parable and someone dressed up as a Pharisee. But important in this parable, like in all the parables of Luke, is it is about, like the lives of the saints that we will celebrate next week, and I'm going to move that off because it's going to fall down on my head. They give us examples of how we are to live in the world. And being a parable, we know and have learned that it's not always straightforward. The classical interpretation, particularly from the Reformed tradition and people like Calvin and people like Karl Barth, which was a theologian of last century, was to read this parable and have it confirm a Reformed perspective of life, which went to emphasize that the tax collector, now tax collectors were people who worked for the Roman Empire. Their job was to collect taxes, and they did so by any means they wanted. Not only did they collect the taxes and the flat fee that went to the Roman Empire, but they also collected above that number. And they exploited the people, and that's how they became rich. Because they collected the money, gave some to the Roman Empire, and kept the rest for themselves. They were ubiquitously despised and seen as lowlife and people not of the people. And so the tax collector was not a person seen by this society as good. So that is one of our characters. The other one is the Pharisee. And the Pharisees were good people. They, like all of us here, came to church. Only them, it was synagogue, but they came to pray. They came into the temple to do their religious duty. We're told that he fasted twice a week, that he went to the temple, he was there for prayers, that he did his tithing. So he gave of his income and life. And not only of his income, he gave of all of what he had. So, he is a respected member of society. And like most of Luke's parables, there is reversal. By the time we get to the end, it will be the tax collector that Jesus says is the one who is justified as he goes home. So what's happening? That classic interpretation said that the tax collector, who was despised by society, knew his position as part of humanity and who knew that what he was participating in was sinful. And so the tax collector says, "Have mercy on me, Lord, for I am a sinner." And it is, in the classical interpretation, our recognition that we are all sinners. And that is part of what we have to ask God for God's mercy on us. And that the Pharisee, who was, by all accounts, pious and dutiful and did what he was supposed to, did not recognize that he too, like the tax collector, lived in a world where he too was sinful. He too had to ask God for God's mercy. And so the classical interpretation is that the point is that we all recognize that we are sinners and have to ask God's mercy. And there's truth in that. But I want to suggest it gets a little more complicated if we don't take these two characters as opposing, where one is good and one is not. If we take these two characters as two sides of all of us, where we are both and, where we play both parts in the world. We who are here come to church. We who are here are religious. We, I suspect, most of us here, at least for the most part, consider ourselves respected members of our society. So what is asked of us? If we put on the hat of the tax collector, like the tax collector, we too participate in systemic evil. We too participate in systems that exploit other people, whether we want to or not. I know when I go to buy clothing, I know that it has been produced in a variety of places around the world. And I know that in some of those places, people's labor and life are exploited. And when I buy that cheap piece of clothing, I don't always know exactly where it's come from, but I can assume that at least a percentage of my closet is clothing that eventually was created from exploitation. I have an iPhone. I know that parts and materials that make my iPhone come from places where people are exploited. I still have that iPhone. So I have to recognize that my life lives like the tax collector in a world where people are exploited, and that I am part of that system. But I also have to remember in an earlier parable where Christ did not tell the tax collector, "Don't go be a tax collector." What Christ said was, "Go and do not exploit the people you collect taxes from." So the charge was to be as just as one could be, as in Christ as what one could be, recognizing that both truths are always there. We are always in need of God's mercy and the mercy to our fellow people in the world. That is the stance we take from the tax collector. And from being that religious person, we are invited into a daily examination of that reality. Part of our chore, part of our task, part of our joy and calling is to recognize that every day when we get up, we will participate in this mixed hybrid world. And that to the best of our ability, we are to recognize and ask ourselves, how do we be just today? How can I be my best self in Christ today? Is it difficult? Yes. But that is the charge we are given. We are never perfect. Hence, we are always in need of God's mercy and God's forgiveness. And we are always in need of recognizing that we ask that of God, and it comes from God, but it also is asked of each other. Who we are in the world, when we look at each other, we know that the Pharisee said, thank God I am not one of those people. I am not a tax collector. I am not a thief. I am not such and such. Now, I know my reaction to that kind of attitude, I have it all the time. If I hear somebody who has a situation that I think is really struggling, like I'll hear that someone has cancer, and in my mind, I have to tell you and admit, I will say, thank God that's not me. Now, I'm sure I have struggles in my life that people look at me and say, thank God I'm not you. That it works both of those ways. But that is also a human reaction. But when that human reaction moves to the place of, no, you are not of the righteous. You, I'm glad I'm not so lowly as you. When I take that difference or that recognition and have it be a place where I can stand in superiority over someone else, that is evil. That is not of God. So it's when we take perhaps might be a human reaction and we turn it into that place where we think ourselves better than someone else, when we do not humble ourselves, that we participate in evil and sin. And that too is part of this daily recognition. Where, as we go along in our lives, does that creep up very slowly and sometimes barely without recognition? So again, it is a daily examination of how am I today, not only honoring God and being my best self, but being myself best self in relationship to other people. And as I go through my day, be it at work, at school, wherever it may be, all of it is so that we as a people move to that place where not only do we stand in God's mercy, but we are able to take that mercy and make it concrete. We are able to actually live the lives of the ideals of the saints, that we each become a little bit like the saints. That it's not just a mask we wear on a Halloween, but it's a life we live 365 days a year. And that is the invitation of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. So I bid you to take that invitation, to take it now and into Halloween and into All Saints and beyond, and to make it part of your life. To be both Pharisee and tax collector alike. And so to ask God daily for mercy and live in Jesus Christ.